There's no need even to have a college degree at all, or even high school. If somebody graduated from a great university, that may be an indication that they will be capable of great things, but it's not necessarily the case. Say people like Bill Gates or Larry Ellison, Steve Jobs, these guys didn't graduate from college. But if you had a chance to hire them, of course, that would be a good idea. You know, just looking just for evidence of exceptional ability, and if there's a track record of exceptional achievement, then it's likely that that will continue into the future.
This is part 2 of the series on the authoritarian view of knowledge. The first part was about peer review. So the first thing I'll bring up is that people with high levels of credentials don't have as amazingly super high IQs as you might think. This is based on 2 things: verbal intelligence from the General Social Survey and from the US Census Adult Literacy Survey. And people cry about me citing my own website. Okay, this is data that Sean last night tabulated together from the General Social Survey and the Adult Literacy Survey. So if you want the original source on this, well, speaking. The Adult Literacy Survey is separated into prose, document literacy, and quantitative literacy. I'm flashing the descriptions of these in front of the screen. Press pause if you want to read them. And just generally for all my videos, oftentimes I'll just flash charts in front of the screen very quickly before moving on. My expectation is that you'll press pause if you're interested, or click on the relevant link in the description. Now, obviously, the Adult Literacy Survey is not an IQ test, and it's almost certainly far more trainable than a real IQ test. But they provided means, medians, and standard deviations, so we can just convert this into a 100-point scale just for visual convenience. But who cares about IQ, you might be saying? Well, you should. It's the most statistically powerful construct in all of social science. It predicts everything to some degree. It dominates virtually every model that predicts quantifiable life outcomes and quantifiable performance on any given task, and it's something that has been refined for over 100 years and has survived more sustained criticism than anything in academia. I feel confident in saying it has survived more intellectual attack than any concept in human history. That's why it's still used by researchers today who would love for it to be meaningless. It's well known that college doesn't really raise your IQ in the long run, and what short-term gains there are from going to college are hollow for G, meaning that they tend to be more a function of skills, not an increase in, for lack of a better term, underlying true intelligence, quote unquote. That's the best way to describe it to someone who hasn't read a lot about this. But they're not experts for their IQ, they're experts for their knowledge of the subject matter. Okay, well, let's look into that. There are several studies on knowledge retention, and knowledge retention varies depending on how much you use it. From Lindsay et al., 2013, from the paper Improving Students' Long-Term Knowledge Retention Through Personalized Review, they looked at the knowledge decay for Spanish students at the University of Colorado, and they found that over the 28-day inter-semester break, there was an 18.1%, 17.1%, and 15.7% knowledge decay in the mass, generic, and personalized spaced review condition. The paper was on methods to improve knowledge retention. So let's say 15% knowledge loss in 28 days. Let's round that to 1 month, since 15% is a little bit below these numbers. How much would you lose in 1 year? Well, obviously it won't be linear, maybe 50% in a year. Now keep in mind that there's a bit of a compression effect. If these are multiple choice questions with 5 answers on average, then there's a floor of 20% from just random guessing. And the average scores for each of the 3 groups is between 65 and 73%. From Bakerd and Stewart, 2006, this is a paper on retention of marketing knowledge entitled How Fast Do Students Forget What They Learn in Consumer Behavior, a longitudinal study. And they looked at how well students who took consumer behavior did on retests. And based on this data, they created a predictive model for how much a student would be expected to remember over time. For the A students, they would go from around 95% to 77% in 2 years, a B student from 85 to 69 in 2 years, and a C student from 75 to 62. This may sound impressive until you realize that the 64% baseline was the score for someone who had never taken consumer behavior, as that was the average score for students who had never taken the class and just had the final handed in front of them. So a C student would be expected in 2 years' time to do worse than the average student at this anonymous US Western university who had never taken the class. An A student would do a little bit better than someone who had never taken the class, but consider that the A student had regressed 58% of the way toward the no training baseline. From Front Law and Zaradnik 2016 from the paper How Much Do Students Remember Over Time? Longitudinal Knowledge Retention in Traditional versus Accelerated Learning Environments, the authors looked at how students who took Introduction to Health Sciences did on a retest 3, 6, and 12 months, and whether being an accelerated or traditional course had any difference on knowledge retention. So here's that data represented here, comparing traditional and super course retention rates. And these are the results after 3, 6, and 12 months. Interestingly, the correct answers for non-repeat questions seem to decay far less than the repeat questions, which is what you would expect. In one group, the non-repeat questions answered correctly actually went up before going down again, but that was just one of the groups. So depending on which group and whether it's repeat or non-repeat questions, you're looking at anywhere from a 29.1% retention to 51% retention, with a weighted average being 37.45% retention after 1 year and a 38.59% weighted average for just the traditional courses, which is what most people take. From Dayon 2006, the paper Knowledge Loss of Medical Students on First Year Basic Courses at the University of Saskatchewan, they looked at test and retest results for introductory neuroanatomy, immunology, and physiology between 10 and 11 months after completion of the class. For neuroanatomy, the relative knowledge loss was 52.7%, for immunology 17.6%, for physiology 19.4%. These decay rates are a little bit lower than the others. From Cohen and Kipps, 1979, this is an older paper from 1979 entitled Factors Determining Student Retention of Economic Knowledge After Completing the Principles of Microeconomics course. They came to the conclusion that student knowledge of economics decays around 18% per year off of the value of the previous year. And this was a very longitudinal study, with an average time out from taking the class being around 15 years at time 2. With an 18% knowledge loss, your absolute amount of knowledge loss would be lower every year, creating a negative power function. So say you have 100 knowledge points. You lose 18 the first year, so now you have 82. Then you lose 14.76 the next year, so that's 18% of 82, so now you have 67.24. By year 3, you're at 55.14 knowledge points. By year 4, you're at 45.21. By year 5, you're at 37.07, and down you go in a negative power relation. From Custer's 2010, this is a meta-analysis on the retention of general science knowledge with a lot of really old studies from the 1920s and 1930s. And for these, retention is just all over the place. That's all I'll say about this as I scroll through all of the results here. I don't really have any commentary on this. And what all these studies tend to show is that for a high retention course, you'll be lucky to have around 80% knowledge retention, or 20% decay after 1 year. But it's not unheard of to have knowledge decay of over 50% for certain subjects in a single year. And based on the paper on the results of Cohen and Kipps in economics, and the results from the Ontario Introduction to Health Sciences study, and the results of the Bacon and Stewart study, the relationship between time and knowledge retention seems to be a negative power relation, with decay leveling out over time. So if you assume a knowledge decay of 18% per year, in 4 years you're down to about 45.2% of that knowledge. In 10 years you're down to 13.74%. Obviously some students won't have this rate of decay, but other subjects will decay even faster than this. But whatever numbers you plug in, you're going to lose a lot of what it is you're taught. So they're not experts for their IQ, they're experts for their knowledge of the subject matter, even though their knowledge of the subject matter in all likelihood depreciates faster than a car. Now look, if you talk to a researcher who has just published a paper about something, he's going to be wicked smart about the thing he just published about, or a general area of his research. However, when you take them from their area of research, i.e. what it is they're publishing papers on or otherwise doing research on, they probably didn't retain that knowledge. So they're no longer necessarily experts, but they maybe can kind of wing it because on average they'll have IQs of around 130 if they're a research scientist who's publishing articles and peer-reviewed papers. They're still smart people, But when you take a psychologist and you throw him into an argument about race differences in IQ, he maybe took 2 classes on that, and maybe 3 or 4 classes on IQ, or maybe even 3 or 4 classes just on psychometrics in general, not IQ specifically. And so he probably forgot about most of that, unless that is his professional area of expertise post-graduation, post-doc. Or if you take a biologist and throw him into an argument about subspeciation in humans, he almost certainly was taught some things about taxonomy years ago and maybe remembers some things from that. But unless his specialty is taxonomy and he's doing research on taxonomy specifically, he doesn't necessarily have any professional expertise on that. He's not necessarily an expert on that matter based on his professional credential. Now, he may still be a smart guy. He may still have otherwise read about the subject being talked about. But what I'm saying is that the amount of knowledge decay that occurs is breathtaking. Yes, they could have done independent research on the topics being argued about, but so could have you or I. It's not abnormal for someone to publish papers outside of their field of credential. This happens all the time. Francis Crick got his bachelor's degree in physics. Then when he became a PhD, it was in biochemistry because he found that to be more interesting. He later became one of the preeminent publishers on the issue of consciousness. James Watson's bachelor's and PhD were in zoology, yet he is best known for his discovery of the double helix. He was rejected from MIT and Harvard and attended the University of Indiana. Seth Roberts got his PhD in psychology, but was most impactful for his work in nutrition, where he came up with the idea that the tastiness of food increased how much you eat and increased your dietary set point. Michael Woodley actually co-authored a paper with Seth Roberts before Seth died. Michael Woodley also happened to get his PhD in biology, early on writing papers debunking cryptozoology. However, he has since become a prolific publisher in psychometrics. Aubrey de Grey is another example of a man who got his PhD in computer science and is now one of, if not the most preeminent researchers on aging and life extension. Charles Darwin is a classic example of a man who was trained in theology, but of course made a revolutionary contribution in biology. What I know of the best are psychometric researchers. So some examples I know of people who publish peer-reviewed papers on psychometrics and even population genetics without having specialized training in these fields are James Flynn, whose original specialty was political science, Charles Murray, political science, Linda Gottfredson, sociology, Satoshi Kanazawa, sociology, Gregory Cochrane, physics, Emil Kierkegaard, linguistics. This is just what I could think up off the top of my head and brainstorming for a little bit. No doubt there will be others mentioned in the comments, I hope. The point being that extreme credentialism is actually not a real barrier within the world of academic research itself. In the world of actually conducting experiments or meta-analyses or something that you're going to write a paper on, it's not really a barrier. Extreme credentialism is more of a barrier outside of academia, in the minds of the public. It's a big deal among people who sort of outsource their thinking. Now, for me, I have co-authored 2 papers that were published in mid-level impact factor review board journals. So for me, this isn't some magical, mystical, man on the mountain kind of thing. And I, of course, just have a bachelor's in history. I have no relevant credential to publish anything in psychometrics. I'm just a guy who read a lot about it. So this was known since at least the 1970s, probably well before that reasonably intelligent laymen with access to statistical prediction rules can make predictions better than the relevant experts in all sorts of domains. For example, when making a diagnosis, a non-trained person would be given a checklist of reported symptoms. And of course, there's a process of operationalizing the answers, which is perhaps to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel here? Is it a sharp or a dull ache, etc.? And then each question has a different weighting, and you come up with a numerical value for the subjective perception of the patient. Operationalization is how the analog is digitized in such a way that we can make concrete, rule-based decisions and how we can create statistical prediction rules. And the norm is that statistical prediction rules outperform expert judgments in just about everything where this comparison has been made. From the 2000 paper, Clinical versus Mechanical Prediction, a meta-analysis, 19-year-old paper, the authors looked at 137 studies comparing clinical predictions versus mechanical prediction. The results were, to me, counterintuitive. Educational and financial fields had the lowest advantage for SPRs over expert judgment. Maybe this is because in education and finance, there's so much data that the experts themselves are largely just using statistical prediction rules. Whereas the forensic and medical fields, I would have predicted that would be what the experts did better at and where SPRs would falter. So I got it precisely backward on those four. And I think it's because I got it precisely backward where I thought SPRs would do well. I assumed SPRs would be most likely to beat experts in fields which seem to be the most statistically based, like finance and educational outcomes. But it looks like in those fields, the SPRs don't beat the experts by as much, precisely because the experts are already kind of using SPRs. Whereas in forensic and medical fields, the experts are relying more on intuition and experience more, which results in the SPRs beating them by a wider margin versus a field that is already kind of using SPRs. For predicting personality traits, I would have guessed that SPRs wouldn't beat experts by as much as the other things, since I know a little bit about psychometric personality tests and that experts already kind of use these statistical prediction rules already. So I'm 1 for 5 out of this. Now, some interesting finds from the paper were, quote, similarly, training and experience, amount of training, general experience in the field, specific task-relevant experience, do not significantly predict the degree of superiority of mechanical over clinical prediction. When results of an interview are used as predictive data, the effect size favors the mechanical prediction more than when no interview is available. What this means is that when clinicians were given an interview of the subject, their psychological assessments were less accurate than when they did not conduct an interview. So conducting an interview generally reduces the accuracy of a clinical assessment. It does not increase it. And an obvious explanation of this is that when you do an interview, you're starting to introduce all sorts of extraneous data, false self-evaluations of the other person, stuff that's not data, stuff that's not statistically validated or shown to have predictive validity. Another quote, use of medical data, physical examination, laboratory tests as predictors is associated with smaller differences. And they show with medical data, weighted mean plus or minus standard deviation is 0.083, standard deviations plus or minus 3. Without medical data, it's 0.16 plus or minus 3.61. So when the medical clinicians had access to laboratory data, their predictions improved. However, they were still inferior to statistical prediction models which did not have access to this data. Now, this analysis was done in 2000. There are 3 reasons to suspect that statistical prediction rules beat clinical judgment by an even greater margin today than they did back in 2000. 1. Increased computing technology and more refined statistical algorithms. Humans forget knowledge over time, and it has to be constantly rebuilt, whereas a predictive model doesn't forget anything and only builds while the human mind has knowledge decay and so must be rebuilt. As there is more and more research to plug into these statistical prediction models, they only build. They never decay unless someone loses the hard drive or something. 2, the inflation of credentials. There are more PhDs than ever before. The value of a PhD is cheaper. There are more quote-unquote experts. They are less of an elite group than they used to be. And 3, the general decline in general intelligence in the United States and worldwide. The median IQ will always be 100 by construction because IQ is a rank order and that's the middle of the curve. But extracted general intelligence has been declining in the West by about 1.25 points per decade. This is small and almost unnoticeable at the middle of the distribution, but at the tails, the effects are going to be greater. At a median of 100 with a standard deviation of 15, the percent of people with an IQ of 130 or above will be 2.28%. If that median falls to 97.5, the percent with an IQ of 130 or above will be 1.51%, or about a third as many people proportionately with an IQ above 130 if they were back in the year 2000. There will still be the same number of people whose IQ score will read 130 because IQ is a rank order score graded on a curve, but that doesn't mean what it used to mean. So the population is less intelligent than it used to be. Credentials are wildly inflated to where the typical expert isn't as elite of a slice of this already less intelligent population, and the layman has more access to statistical prediction rules and information than at any time in the past. All of these facts result in expert judgment not having the same relative value as it used to have. Ironically, the norms have not only not kept up with these changes, but have gone the other way because the general population is less intelligent, and thus they trust experts more than ever before. Another thing we should look into is the prevalence of mobbing and bullying. Mobbing is a term for when a group of people find a target and gossip about him, try to find any fault they can in what he does, and pathologize those faults, often try to get him fired or get others around him to turn on him. And I think we all know what bullying is, and I think we've all experienced what mobbing is. Now, I have a bunch of papers on the prevalence of academic mobbing and bullying, but unfortunately, the papers all have different methods and time frames. This, I think, explains the radical variation in results that you see here, as it seems intuitively implausible that specific regions and universities would so radically vary in their actual rate of bullying and mobbing. The only paper I found that did a cross-industry comparison on rates of bullying to compare universities to was Hull and Cooper, and they found universities near the bottom, just slightly above retail and manufacturing, which had the lowest. From Hull and Cooper, the unweighted average is 11.02, so the 10.6 value that they have here must have been weighted somehow, though they don't say how in the paper. Maybe it's N-weighted, or maybe it's weighted by percentage of the UK population employed in each sector, but an unweighted value is 11.02. So if we just look at the rate of bullying as an indicator of the level of emotional maturity of a field, we can say that universities are at roughly the same level of emotional maturity as the hotel industry and retail, but significantly less emotionally mature than manufacturing, and significantly, but not radically, more emotionally mature than the labor force in general if we were to take Hull and Cooper's results as definitive. But consider there are some fields at the very top here, which if you were to exclude, would make the rate of bullying and mobbing in universities seem less impressive compared to the average, as these fields, I believe, drag up the average. Now, these numbers are lower than what most of the other studies show, but since it's the only cross-field comparison I could find, it indicates that academia has about 65.3% of the level of bullying that exists in other fields using an unweighted value, or 76.3% as much bullying if we use Hull and Cooper's weightings, whatever those are. So maybe they're a little bit more emotionally mature than the general working population, but it's not to the point where we could say they're like the adults and we're the children. And there's also the possibility that they're straight up less emotionally mature and are just less overt about their vendettas, less overt about their prejudices, and just not liking your face to where it's not so obvious that people would report it. Because again, the average IQ of someone with a postdoctorate education is going to be around 120. So these are going to be people who might be a little bit more crafty in how they undermine people they just don't like. So even these numbers, we shouldn't assume are entirely a function of emotional maturity and could just be them being better at concealing their grudges. Now look, if someone makes a good argument, they make a good argument, whether they're a molecular biochemist or a janitor. I'm certainly not saying to go, oh, that argument comes from a university, dismiss it, and instead go to the local bowling alley if you want the real scoop on how the world works. No, I'm simply saying to not trust experts, to not trust the title. So the first takeaway is that a large proportion of their knowledge gets lost, around 18% a year if we're being generous. It's probably more than that, but I'm feeling nice, let's say 18% a year. This is roughly the same as the rate that a car depreciates. This decay of knowledge has no impact on the stature and competence of a research as far as people know. In fact, it is not uncommon for researchers to shift their focus to an entirely different field for which they were not trained in and have no credential in at all, and to be just as successful as those who are credentialed in that field from the start. Second takeaway, when mechanical predictions are possible, they are usually superior to predictions made by clinical experts, even when those experts have access to more data than the statistical prediction rule has. Moreover, clinical experts still underperform statistical prediction rules when they have access to the results of statistical prediction rules in making their own prediction. The third takeaway, to the extent prevalence of bullying is a proxy for emotional maturity in a group, we can say that academics probably aren't significantly, or I should say substantially, any more emotionally mature than the general working population, which is something to consider when asking whether or not academics are going to be immune to groupthink, to fall for hokey belief systems, or blackball those with heterodox views. And in fact, this danger may be even greater for them since they have the ability to justify any belief they want. A dangerous combination of being fairly smart, but also being perceived as being extremely smart.